Welcome everyone. Good morning. I see the chat box is becoming active, which is really good. So we're going to kick off this morning, this second in our series of FAAM webinars. The first one is, as some of you remember, was the asbestos limits. We had a discussion on the limits that are being introduced in Europe and what impact they might have on the UK. And this webinar is really a discussion on the impact of protecting workers removing asbestos and how can we measure that exposure. So this webinar series is a part of our FAAM's discussion. It is a discussion. We're not looking at changing anything. We're just wanting to open a discussion of professionals talking about the science behind this and, where do we want to go in the future. Today, we're going to focus, as I say, on the need to measure air concentration. And to discuss this topic, we've got three speakers. Gary will present a short presentation overview of really where we are and what we're going to discuss today. Then we'll have Nick Garland. He will present his thoughts in his presentation. And then once Nick has finished his presentation, we'll just have a short break. Well, I say short, it'll be about 20 minutes of Q&A. And this is where the questions come in. So we've got the first 4 questions in the chat box. We'd like you to think about them, answer them, but if you can prefix your answer with the particular question you want to answer, then that would be really helpful to help us monitor them as we go through. So we really need your interaction, your input to help us further discuss these topics today. Once we've done that, we'll go on to our last presentation. This is a presentation from Mark McGonigal. He's a site supervisor with over 30 years experience, and he'll talk about his insights, but he can't be with us in person, so we've got a pre-recorded video. We've also got some questions that he has posed as well that we need to discuss as professionals. So we'll get to set those as well. So perhaps Lee, if you can put the questions back in. I've just seen Colette said can't see any questions. So if you can put those questions back in the chat box, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So at the very end, we'll have another session just to wrap up on Q&A of anything that's come up. We will try our best to keep ahead of all the answers. We'll do that, but the ones that we don't get to answer, we will put out in a sort of correspondence after the webinar today. So I'm going to hand over to Gary. He's going to introduce his session, and then we'll roll on to Nick. Thank you.
All right, good morning. So what this webinar is about, as you can see from the title, let's just get everything running. One moment. Okay, that's better. When do we really need to measure the air concentration? When I tell people about the EU directive, right, I've got a chat box. All right, yes. When we tell people about the EU directive, you often get what, how, when, as the kind of words in response. So what we're talking about today is the when, but in a slightly different format as to when do we need to measure the concentration of asbestos in air so we can best protect asbestos workers. So what we're talking about is what we're talking about is the types of asbestos workers and personal sampling. So if we look back at the history of EU directives and really the history of asbestos work, there were 3 groups in particular: the production, manufacturing and installers who got the early exposures. Now these groups in the West don't really exist anymore. They're part of epidemiology, but it's many years since we manufactured and installed asbestos. So the groups of asbestos workers we're interested in are maintenance and removal workers and well, maintenance and renovation workers. So in the past, the production and manufacturing were in very sort of stable workplaces, you know, and job types. So measuring an 8-hour occupational exposure limit was quite a reasonable thing to do. But as the jobs have now changed to maintenance, and renovation and removal, it's very often, especially for maintenance, you're at different sites and dealing with different scenarios, types of materials, periods of disturbance and exposure. They all vary on a day-to-day basis. So the concept of an 8-hour occupation exposure limit measurement as being representative is much more problematic in the current real life environments. So I'm going to give this theoretical example just because the maths is easy. If you've got an 8-hour period, 480 minutes, and for roughly 5 minutes, 4.8 minutes, somebody's hacking away at an asbestos board and gets exposed at 10 fibres per ml. Over an 8-hour period, that will, you know, divide by 480, will reduce by 100 times. So you'll be back at the current control limit of 0.1 and more or less compliant with your exposure. But is that an acceptable thing we want to happen? You know, do we want people exposed to high peaks without knowing about it? So how best can we monitor and understand workers' exposures in the current environment? So hopefully I've explained rather poorly in this case, but that's the topic, is when do we really need to measure the exposure? And we're talking about personal sampling and hopefully most of the time personal air sampling. And we're just parked to one side what we do with the filters. So there are 4 questions here. Does the 8-hour time weighted average offer the best protection? Should we do more to identify and measure the peak disturbances so we know how to control and reduce exposure? With the proposed reduction in the OEL, you know, can we rely on all our previous measurements? You know, if we're looking at 10 times lower, do we really know that this works? And how frequently do we need to take air measurements to know that we have things under control? So these will appear in the chat box, and I'll now try and stop sharing. And I'm going to hand over to Nick Garland, who I'm very happy to blame for this whole topic of this seminar, because he had a bit of a rant at our last FAAM committee meeting, and I phoned him up afterwards and I said, Nick, that is just the thing we need to talk about. So when do we need to measure? Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen, but yes, that is absolutely how it happened. I spoke passionately about the last webinar, saying that, you know, I thought that we were potentially worrying about the wrong problem, and I got absolutely nailed for this. In fact, the moment of getting the hospital pass does feature in this, so I'll come to that in a minute. So yeah, I'm going to be talking what is the point of personal monitoring, and I thought I'd start with some real basics, just briefly. There are 2 real main tests that are currently done predominantly by licensed contractors. There's the specific short duration activity, or SSDA, and that is focused on whether the method was successful or not. And that's by far the most common test that's done. We also have the 4-hour control limit test, which is more commonly known as the 4-hour time weighted average. Incidentally, we do 4 hours rather than 8 hours that they do in Europe, just purely because of the technology at the time that we introduced this and the practicality of running a pump for such an extended period. And this test is all about the person. What is their exposure over a shift? And importantly, we can use the protection factor of the mask because we're talking about the exposure directly to the operative. So the control limit is key to this last test, and we all know what our control limit is, which is 0.1. The European equivalent of that is 0.01. So that's the current. Got 2 years implementation, but that's the current OEL that in Europe, and they are going to be reducing it further after that as well. So as I say, our control limit 0.1, importantly after RP protection, is the target that we need for the is the target that we need for this testing. So we're allowed to use the protection factor, and a full face protection factor is 40. So the way you work out the target is control limit test is 0.1 times by 40, and we get to a horrifyingly high fiber release of 4 fibers per milliliter. The European OEL would drive that down by a factor of 10, so that's 0.4, and it's down to 0.08 in 2 years' time with the proposed additional further reduction. Now, the SSDA, that's just down to the larks. That's their assessment of what should happen, what is the likely exposure if the method is followed correctly. So let's look at a bit of data. I plucked out 3 different removal techniques, quite common ones: removal of AIB, either nail or screw, and removal of insulation residue. And the average anticipated exposure level set by licensed contractors is just there, 0.172, 0.15, and 0.089. And the average personals here in the middle is 0.048, 0.05, and 0.06. So those are personals actually specifically targeting removal AIB nail. And at the end here, we've got the number of personals in the period I was measuring. So what can we take from this? Well, certainly there is some error there. So I think it's extremely unlikely that this will be precisely to 3 decimal places 4.000 fibers per milliliter. It's much more likely that they've incorrectly put 4 fibers into the wrong field in the database. But the other thing we can take from this is the anticipated levels are very, very low. And there is quite a bit of data to support this, this assumption. So where's this data coming from? Well, you probably are aware that I started some years ago now Assure 360, which is a database, an app system designed to help larks do all of the complicated things that we've been asking them to do for 20 years, and importantly, do it themselves so they can actually participate in the process, learn and become more expert in the whole exercise. There's 18,000 personals, roughly speaking, on the system, which is pretty much the the best resource in the country, I would say, and potentially in Europe as well. There is, in the last 2 years, we've got 9,000 personals, and that's where the data that we've just been looking at has come from. What does the data tell us? Well, if we look again at the targets, so the after the protection factor, 4 fibers per milliliter current control limit, 0.4 European OEL, and 0.08 is the proposed in a couple of years. The vast majority of those 9,000 air tests, those personal monitoring, are actually below the 0.4 fibers per milliliter. And in fact, there's 95% are below the 0.08 as well. So a huge majority of actually we are already achieving these very, very low levels of what we need to actually comply with the changes in the OEL. But then when I was talking about this data to Gary, and this was the moment after the last seminar, saying, well, actually, we're looking at the wrong problem. We shouldn't be looking at SEM and things like that. We should be looking at controlling exposure. And when I presented these sort of figures to Gary, he rather irritatingly just refused to believe it. Not that the data was wrong, but the fact that what is happening after we test. Yes, sure, we're getting these low readings when we're actually testing them, but when we're not testing them, are we going to be getting sky-high readings? And that's frankly quite an irritating line, because it's extremely difficult to challenge and argue against. But what it drove me to think about really is, if we don't know what's going on in the enclosure, and as soon as we test it, we find saints, but the reality is we've got sinners in the enclosure. Does personal monitoring impact real exposure at all? Because as soon as we test, the behavior changes. So observe, Schrodinger's operative, as soon as it's observed, then we're not actually getting what the real behavior was in the enclosure. So why on earth do we test at all in the first place? Are we policing behavior, or should we be partners in delivering a project? So back to Schrodinger's operative. If observed behavior is not always normal behavior, it does actually tell us what is possible. So carefully following the method as demonstrated and as it's been written down in the standard procedures and tested, gives us what is possible, what is achievable by that particular method. And that was the data that we were looking at earlier. And is that really where we should be focusing our efforts? Prove the method, ensure the method is followed, and then assume the control limit test results. So how do we prove a method? So the key features, in my opinion, are independence. So analysts are independent of the desire to get a low end result. Academic rigor, so a test that is designed in such a way that is going to be able to stand up to challenge and questioning. Certainly careful and very extensive monitoring, so lots of tests in and around the activity, and we actually video the activity as well. So we match the data to the behavior, and again we can go back, can check, we can challenge, we can review. Now, a good example of that has been the FAAM gel cutting exercise. Over the last year or so, we've selected a couple of sites, a couple of completely different licensed contractors, different analysts, different pipes, different work environments, and different operatives, obviously, as well. And then the project was designed in such a way that would actually ultimately lead to a peer-reviewed article, which is going to be going hopefully into the BOHS annals. So what are better uses for our testing that we can actually, actually spend our time where we're actually doing some good? So in my opinion, we really need to be focusing on leak testing, transit and waste runs, dismantling of enclosures. Somebody else mentioned actually building of enclosures as well. Reproving the method itself. So testing occasionally that the method that is being used on site is still achievable in getting those low results. And then demonstrating competence. It becomes part of training to actually test the operative, doing the exercise carefully and as per the procedure whilst we're watching them, and do they achieve the low results that we expect? So I'm going to ask you pose some final questions. I think these are going to be going on the chat as well, about around the things that we do, because at the end of the day, the whole point of these webinars are to encourage conversation, encourage debate, and encourage us to start genuinely thinking about what we do in line with the guidance, to actually really understand that the the actual, we do what we do for reasons. We don't do what we do to comply with guidance. So actually, we have a role to play in this, where we're reimagining and we're rethinking exactly how we're doing things, rather than just blindly following guidance. So if observed behavior is good behavior, how do we make all behavior observed? Do we get all operatives to wear body cams, for example? Do we reintroduce dedicated in-enclosure supervision? Are there other ways that we can actually encourage or simulate this idea that careful removal is done only when being observed? Should the role of analysts be policing good behaviour, or should we be partners in delivering a safe project? And that different way of thinking about a particular project and our role in the exercise, and how that might affect working together. And then what do you consider the most effective way to ensure good practice is followed? So that's harking back to the observed behaviour, but potentially there might be lots of other ways that you can think of as well. So that's about all I had to say on the matter, but I'm sure there's been a few questions, and we'll pass to that. And I think Sarah is going to be taking back over now.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for that. There's a lot of thought that's gone into that, Nick, and I think there are a lot of questions as well. But surprisingly, I think we've baffled everyone because we haven't had a lot of chat. So I'm going to just go through what we've had so far, and perhaps you and Gary can answer some of the questions. One of the questions posed is about personal monitoring from Jonathan. Who's actually doing personal monitoring? Because I must admit, as testing laboratory, including myself, we don't get asked to monitor larks very often, and if we do, it's not always we don't really understand what's going on inside the enclosure, and sometimes we're just asked to come and do some personals. What do you think of that, Nick?
Well, certainly personals are being done, and okay, the 360 system is a system that is paid for. So, and as I've said, 20% of larks use it. Maybe that is a subset of larks because by the nature of them paying for a system to help them do things better, that makes them into automatically gold standard contractors. That is potentially the case, but as I say, there are quite a lot of testing that is being done, and my understanding is it is a combination of specifically employed analysts to do that task, and also analysts that are it just happen to be on the site because they're employed by the client, the end client. They've just been, can you do some personals as well? The latest guidance has helped. The latest asbestos network guidance has helped a little with that as well. But they certainly are being done. I can't tell you who they are. It is possible to find out from the database, but I haven't got that to hand.
Thanks, Nick. It's certainly getting in the chat. There's some others like Ed that's saying they do them quite regularly, and Louise is saying that personal monitoring is normally, unless it's the final clean, we're rarely asked to do personal monitoring. It's normally for very short periods. So are we really getting the data that we need? I know in your gold standard you are, but what about all the other contractors that are working, and they're working in dangerous environments, particularly one-day AIB removal, which is often nailed, very difficult to remove, under a lot of pressure because a tenant has left their property or their home, and obviously councils are putting pressure onto those, and they're very difficult to manage, very difficult to monitor, because we're talking about minutes rather than sort of hours of potential exposure. Is there a risk there to the asbestos removal contractor from that kind of work?
I mean, I personally think there potentially is, because we're putting pressure on them, time pressure on them to actually get them out of that. But if we the only way that, in my opinion, I think, or coming to this opinion, the only way that person monitoring can affect that is if we test every single exercise, because then we compel every single exercise to be carefully completed exactly following the agreed procedure. So monitoring doesn't actually help. It's more that we need to ensure that the method is followed, and that is, I think, where we need to be focusing our attention, is how do we ensure that the operatives follow the method that we know works. And that, I think, involves a different way of thinking about it. But surely you're absolutely right. Anything that's short duration, time pressure is going to encourage the health and safety shortcutting. Just slightly easier, slightly quicker, but more dangerous procedure to be adopted.
So Colette's asking here about, we do have CCTV regularly on site. Some of it is very good and getting better. Obviously, it depends where the camera's pointed, whether we're going to get any good information on behaviour. What about body cams? Is that stepping over into, a realm that we haven't been to before, looking at actual behaviour in the enclosure? How would Larks feel about that? What are your clients telling you in Assure 360?
Well, I mean, body cams is something I've thought of for this webinar as an idea, as a way of as a way of observing. I have heard anecdotally when some licensed contractors have the CCTV filming all of their enclosures, and it's a live feed back to the office, so that the operatives know that they are being potentially watched by the bosses at all times. And anecdotally, they say that improves behaviour on site. The problem with CCTV typically is, like you just said, is it pointing in the right direction? And often cameras are knocked out of the way accidentally or on purpose, and then that means that actually your field of view is not always perfect. The idea of body cams is that each person is then responsible for their own camera. So if operative B consistently is not having the camera operating, then we know that's a behaviour issue directly with them.
So Laurie mentioned here that even when HSE were doing some research project, I remember Laurie presenting, and Daniel as well, that they had CCTV recording activities. HSE were monitoring it, and for the first day or two, good behaviour was seen and recorded, but then people got used to it, and so behaviour can be monitored, and it can do good things if they've got some kind of watching. But if there are any consequences, then, or maybe they don't understand what they're doing is actually going to cause them potential harm or risk to others, then maybe CCTV and body cams aren't the answer.
Yeah, I mean, it might not work. It might not work, but if we know that when people are being watched, they are more likely to be to actually follow the procedure they know they should be following, then it might not be body cams, but we have to think of something else, because we definitely know that person monitoring only tells us what's happening in that initial snapshot, and the only reason why the HSE got great results, i.e. true results, is because they were monitoring all of the time, which commercially is unlikely to be something that actually we can do.
So is it looking at Bruce's post a sort of question here about monitoring, using PCM, we're not using real-time monitoring at the moment. We can only capture a sort of essence of what's going on inside the enclosure. So if you're running a pump for a certain length of time, then you're only going to capture what's happened in that time period, not what's happened in peak exposure. So Gary, maybe you want to come in on this one. What about understanding peak exposure, and how do we monitor that without real-time monitoring? I know we've been doing it for a very long time now.
Yeah, one thing that does occur to me is that there are personal dust monitors, which work by light scattering, which can be worn on the belt. It's not ideal, but at least it's personal. And these things are fairly easy, to run and collect data on how much dust is in the air. So even though you're not monitoring fibers, I always say if you can disturb the dust without disturbing the asbestos fibers, you're much cleverer than I am. So I think dust monitoring is something to be thought about and discussed as a way forward of really protecting the workers from those peak levels that probably rarely, if ever, get sampled. And let's face it, if you get a really bad result, you're not going to take it to your HSE relicensing interview and say, oh yeah, we had 20 fibers per ml last year, so I think, there is that issue that bad data is buried data.
Sure. And what about, Bill posed a question, just thinking about personal exposures related to workers wearing what they're actually inhaling. So in other words, looking at the RPE question again, have we got the right levels to cope with those peaks when they're working physically hard, often in, maybe warm conditions where masks aren't correctly fitted, or maybe, they're not intentionally incorrectly fitted, but we've got all those challenges where they could end up with exposure inside their mask. How can we look again at RPE and whether they're actually giving the protection factors that we associate with asbestos removal? Either Nick or Gary.
Yeah, I mean RPE is critical, and we don't really know what the protection factor is. I mean, we did research, decades ago. I remember where I was when it went from 2000.
We'll have to authorize that.
But the different countries have different protection factors for exactly the same mask. So understanding what the genuine protection factor is crucial. Essentially, the masks have not changed. They're converted gas masks, World War II gas masks, essentially. So masks have not changed very much in a very long time. Vicky mentioned about the trying to have a look at body cams before, and she really struggled because they never stay put and so on, or very expensive. But that is a challenge potentially for the manufacturers. Is can we incorporate a camera housing into the mask itself, so it just clips to the mask, that kind of thing. But yeah, peak exposure is going to be a problem, but it comes down to following the method. If they follow the method, there isn't going to be peak exposure. The reason why there's peak exposure is because a removal contractor is either intentionally doing something fast and dangerous, or in the case of AIB, there's breakage, but then the breakage happens because they've not actually found all of the fixings and removed the fixings, or approached the method in such a way that, right, I can't remove all of these fixings, therefore method 2 should be used in these sort of situations. So these peak exposures happen, and the reason why we can find the peak exposures is the SSDA testing. So the SSDA testing that I was talking about is where we're looking specifically at the method, and the 4-hour or the 8-hour time-weighted average is always going to hide those peak exposures. So we're not going to really understand these peak exposures unless we really understand the methods that are being used.
Thank you, Nick. There's also a practical issue of using, expensive gear on site from the analytical point of view, and is often, harshly treated, let's say, inside enclosures. So, we have a bit of education there to deal with why we're testing people at the coalface, as it were, and why we need them to give us decent results, or at least attempt to. I've certainly had pumps turned off before, or damaged, or returned to me, sort of in a poor state. So there is some work to do, and really innovation is key in this, isn't it? In this sector, we need some more innovation to track real-time monitoring, which, as Gary mentioned, it is something we're going back to maybe rather than going forward, but I'm sure there's some more innovation. Of course, we had the Alert 1000, 2000 series, and unfortunately that's gone to the wayside, but potentially there's an opening for something that could do real-time monitoring. So thank you for all those questions. Lots of food for thought. I think we'll move on to our next presentation, our final presentation, which is pre-recorded. As I said, Mark couldn't be with us today, but hopefully listening to his side of it as a lark. And of course, larks are, key to this. We need to work together. And of course, many of them are, sort of contributing to this webinar today. So let's hand over to Lee, and he will play the video. Thank you, Lee.
No worries. I'm just going to share my screen now. So that's it there. So I'm just going to mute myself again and then play the video, and I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat box to make sure that it can be heard. It might fall out of sync at times between the audio and the visual, but you should be able to hear it all the way through anyway.
We've known each other for a good few years now, but it's probably worthwhile if you just introduce yourself and who you are, and what you've been up to, and what you do, and who you work for.
My name's Mark McGonigal. I work for Asbestec Limited. I've been in the industry over 30 years, probably over 25 years of them as a supervisor. I run big jobs, site manager on them jobs, really. Yeah, and I pride myself on my work, to be quite honest with
you. Yeah. So, as I think I mentioned off camera, that the point of this webinar is really try to have a fresh look at how we prevent or reduce exposure to operatives. And I mean, the starting point is a project has been designed and then handed to you in the form of a method statement or a set of RAMs. That's your first interaction with the job. What do you need to do next? What do you actually find yourself doing to help translate that into reality on the site?
Obviously, when you've received the RAMs, you go through the RAMs, basically set the job up the way the RAMs are telling you. If there's anything that you think through experience, you might be able to speak to your contracts manager regarding something could be elsewhere, something could be better on the site itself. I would call the contracts manager, and if he agrees, I'll just wait for an amendment. And yeah, I'll just set the job up the way that we've both agreed on, really. I mean, my contracts manager at Asbestec does ask for input during the planning stages of some jobs anyway, so I can put my input in before we even get to site.
Yeah, and how do the operatives know what to do? And
the first day, obviously, I get operatives on site. We'd sit down in the site canteen or wherever, and I would actually read the RAMs out to the operatives, because they don't always take the time to sit down and read them themselves. And then they basically know what I want from them, and I can point them in the direction of first on the job, first thing I want them to do.
And is that the end of it? Are you confident then that actually it's all going to run smoothly, and
It's constant supervision throughout. That's just the crux of it, to be quite honest with you. You need to supervise all the time. You need to be on the job. You need to be at the work face, not all the time, because obviously you've got things to do in the office regarding paperwork and checking. And that's obviously one of the first things I do is check all the paperwork's in place before they even start working on my site.
So what do you reckon the best way that we can ensure operatives aren't exposed, or their exposure is absolutely minimized?
It's supervision is the main thing. It's supervision at the workplace, making sure they're doing everything as per RAMs, obviously anticipated levels and things like that. It's just making sure the RAMs are adhered to, and I'm obviously on hand all times to answer any questions they may have. Obviously, it is the main thing is that they are following the RAMs and my guidance as well.
And what do you think the main reasons they might drift or stray from the method, or intentionally just not follow the method?
I think a lot of it to do with time. I think they want to get things done as soon as possible. When my attitude all the time is do it slowly, methodically, the job becomes easier and quicker anyway. I think they do try and rush things, sometimes to get home earlier, but that is one of the things. I don't think operatives look after their sets as well as they should do, i.e. mask sets. I don't think they keep them as clean as what they should do. It is basically sometimes in cutting corners when I'm not about, which could in turn expose them to asbestos.
Are they complacent? Do they think just because they're wearing a mask of any variety, that actually that makes them feel as though they're not going to have any consequences and they can't get exposed because they're wearing a mask?
Yeah, that is one. I mean, obviously your mask is your last line of defence. That is the last line of defence. Sometimes if I do especially on a monthly mask check, I go through them rigorously, and there's a bit dirt. It's a bit dirty. There might be a little slit in a mask or something like that. I'm telling them they can't go in an enclosure because that mask is not working properly how it should be. They're like, well, just don't want me to work, basically. And I'm saying, no, that mask is protecting you. I'm doing this for your safety. But obviously, sometimes they don't understand it like that.
Do you think the methods are structured in such a way that actually there are easier, quicker ways that things can be done, and those easier, quicker ways are actually just going to lead to higher exposure?
Yeah, there is quicker ways to strip asbestos than the way it should be done, but we all know that's not what should be done. It's like stripping AIB should be done slowly, methodically, with your dust suppression techniques in place. But you'll get some operatives that just all they want to do is drag it down, for want of a better word. See, that's not the way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They won't bother spraying. Again, it's something they just think, we don't need to do that in a minute. We'll just drag it down, bake it up, job done. But obviously, the industry's not like that anymore. I will say anymore because it used to be like that.
And what about equipment? Is the right equipment at the right time? Is that an influencer on whether a method gets followed?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say about equipment is, again, it's something that doesn't get cleaned properly, which is an issue as well. I mean, I personally believe that the easiest way for us in the industry to get exposed, obviously not going in enclosed with no mask, it is the cleanliness of equipment. I mean, I reiterate all the time to the lads inside enclosures, make sure your vacs are clean, make sure your roving heads are clean, because at the end of the job, you've got to take these apart, put them in the van. If undoing a roving head and it's just full of dust, obviously that is one easy way of getting exposed. That's one of the first things you check all the time is when I go in enclosures is plant. Make sure your plant is clean because it's the easiest way of getting exposed.
There's obviously only one of you on site. How do you spread yourself so thin that you can?
Difficult. It's very difficult. You're not going to lie. I mean, bigger jobs that I do, obviously, I do have charge hands and a supervisor with me, a couple of supervisors. But yeah, it is difficult. Sometimes you can't be in two places at once. You've also got clients to deal with sometimes, and you've got operatives on site, and you are thinking to yourself, I hope they're doing everything right on site, doing it properly, and not going to do anything that's going to make me uncompliant. Yeah, it's difficult. There's no doubt about it.
After we stop the camera.
Not quite sure what happened there. Did we abruptly stop?
Yeah, there was a couple of minutes. There's about a minute after that point that we didn't have the video feed for. So I don't know whether whether we want to play that at the end.
I think, shall we stop there? Because I'm looking at the time and time is travelling quite quickly. Do you think you've got everything that you wanted to deliver from that, Nick?
Mark talked about communication as being key with operatives, actually just communicating directly with them and management skills effectively. And he also talked in that last bit about actually engaged with the idea of the the change in the OEL as well. You're just saying how much of a challenge that would be. So that was mainly what he was talking about at the end there.
Okay, thank you. Well, it was interesting to hear a different perspective, particularly someone that's got to deal with that and also a license holder as well in their own right. So they've got a huge number of responsibilities, and trying to manage operatives inside an enclosure doing dangerous work is very difficult. We've got a number of questions that have come through, and I think Bruce might have answered one of them, but it was about looking at asbestos disease incidents in operatives undertaking licensed asbestos work. Well, we must have something going back quite a few decades of licensed work now. I think the HSE did do some work on that, and maybe Laurie can post that if it's available to him, to look at sort of what the risks are. So perhaps Bruce, you could share that study in the chat if you've got it to hand. If not, I'm sure we could follow up later on. So we've got a couple of questions that we're just putting up now, question 8 and 9. We had 9 in total, just to see if it sparks any comments. But just going backwards, just looking at Andy Woodyat just put in from the client's point of view, they ask all their larks on their jobs to conduct personal monitoring as sort of mandatory requirement of working on their site. And larks have come to expect that as part of the norm. And he sort of believes that this has sort of created a sort of mutually beneficial working environment where behaviours and rarely poor results are achieved, because there is that sort of understanding between that safe work means good work, and therefore the results are not going to impact on the wider community in their workforce. So that's exceptional, and we would love that for all clients to understand that. And he's asking whether it should be mandatory that clients make it sort of a mandate as part of the contract process, rather than relying on larks or the analysts deciding when or not to conduct personals. I don't know what Nick, you think about that, having something mandatory or Gary.
Mandatory personals. Yeah, I mean, mandatory personals. I mean, does anything that we get more personals done is good, but I think it's more focused on the short duration, the specific short duration activity to actually improve that method. I think clients should be booking an awful lot more personals than leak testing than they actually do at the moment. I think, you know, those are that's activity that analysts can do. And some of the points of, you know, these very short duration 30-minute activities, 5 minutes of potential peak exposure, but for 30 minutes, do we test that? Well, you know, if the analyst just observed, you know, for those 30 minutes instead, then, you know, is that going to have a similar effect of, you know, just minimizing exposure? But yeah, more air testing is certainly a good thing, and you know, but I think there's different ways that we can do it to actually achieve similar and better goals.
So I think one thing that's coming out, and Mark mentioned it, was the actual quality of the operatives coming forward to do the work in the first place. And there is quite a lot of discussion we've had recently about agency staff and the quality or lack of quality. So they might be sacked as a cohort from one job. This is a very large site, and then they're employed by someone else on a different part of the site. So, you know, sort of training needs analysis, sort of all of that sort of seems to come up, because obviously if you've got operatives that are willing to take higher risks, then you are going to have problems in terms of, you know, peak exposure being over and above that anticipated exposure that is in most RAMs. We also, Kat's just sort of pointed out about analysts understanding the type of tests they're actually conducting, and that is a big issue at the moment. I think there's a lot of work to do there on retraining analysts in understanding what personals are and why they need to be done in certain ways. I don't know whether anyone else has got some thoughts on that. Gary, have you got some thoughts on what we could do?
I'd just like to say that control at source is the key issue. And if you don't monitor when that peak emission is taking place, you know, when you're actually removing it, you don't know what people are being exposed to, and you don't know whether your controls are working. So even if you haven't got a you know, a pump on, I think a dust monitor or something would at least give us information. And I think just bringing it back to when should we actually measure, it must be during peak disturbance activity. If we can control that, that takes away hopefully 90% of the potential exposure from the whole job. You know, people can do other silly things, I know, but it's when you start taking it off or hacking it off that is when the exposure happens. So that's my view.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Colette's just pointed out, and Darren has as well, that maybe LARCs don't understand personal monitoring. I know there is an ARCA personal monitoring course which doesn't have a wide uptake, but maybe there's a bit more training to do between analysts and LARCs in the same classroom. Colette's pointed out that NORAC is producing some guidance and some training there, so that could be very helpful too. So I think I'm just going to finish off now because time is mounting on. Everyone's going to start getting hungry, and I don't want anyone being hangry. So I'm going to just ask Nick for a final comment, and then you, Gary, as well, before we just do some closing slides. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, so I mean, some great comments there, and I do like. I mean, when Gary first started talking about the dust monitoring, I do really like that idea. You know, and the fact that potentially, you know, they could be set to alarm as well when you know, excessive dust is. So, you know, I think this all reinforces the, you know, the ability of continuous monitoring, but instant reaction, and whether that is by a dust monitor like that or being observed or something like that. You know, I think all of these things working towards immediate response to poor behavior, I think, is what we need to be doing.
Just very briefly, bringing it back to the beginning, if we don't get when we sample right, all the flash analysis, how we do it, and that is just a waste of time. You know, it's sampling, and when you sample, that is far more important.
Thank you, Gary. Just going to share my screen and just finish off with a couple of slides just to bring today's webinar to close. So after the webinar today, an email will go out to those that are registered for the webinar. We're going to send out a little research questionnaire to gather more information and views. So when that lands in your inbox, please respond. Be very helpful to us to understand where we need to concentrate the next set of webinars or guidance or whatever it will be that comes out of it. And of course, both on the BOHS YouTube channel, if you're linked to that, then you can follow up with the past webinar and this one as well. And everything from the chat box today, we will review and we will send out in a sort of post-webinar email. The next one in our series is Thinking Outside the Box. Bit of a cryptic title there. We'll have to wait and see what happens with this one, but it's at 11 o'clock on the 21st of November. So it will go out, an invitation will be, so we'd be grateful if you could sign up to that. And this will be presented by the FAAM Research Committee, and we're looking at ways to improve analytical methods. And of course, we've already alluded to that with the dust monitor that some of you might have used in your career. Then after Christmas, we've got another series, and we're very open to people suggesting topics and of course speakers as well. So if you want to get involved, please contact us through the marketing@bohs.org, and we will consider all sort of topics to discuss on these series of webinars, and also sort of anyone that would want to come forward to speak, you're very welcome. Not forgetting, we've got, for FAAM members, we've got a free workshop on electron microscopy. So if you don't know a lot about electron microscopy, we talk about it a lot, but what does it actually mean? Can we use it more? Should we be using it more? As you know, in HSG 248, we've got microvacking instead of the dreaded swab sampling. So come and find out more about it. They're free. We don't often get something for free. You have to buy your own lunch, but the workshop's actually free. We've got one at Brunel University next week on the 24th of September. If you'd like to come along, please do register and through the BOHS, in your FAAM membership, go and register there. And also we have one on the 7th of October up at HSE in Buxton, which will be another leading on looking at SEM and how it can be helpful to us. And this is on the 7th of October, which is the day before the asbestos conference. We still have the early bird, so if you're a FAAM member, you get a cheaper ticket than if you're not a FAAM member. But please, look at the program, come along. We've got international speakers, we've got homegrown speakers, and we're going to be talking a lot about what's happening in our, in the UK, but also wider afield as well, and posing some interesting dilemmas as well. So please come along the 8th and 9th of October. Well, that's it for this webinar. Thank you so much for attending. We really do appreciate your time. We know time is precious, but these discussions are very important to thinking about how can we bring things together, how can we move forward, and with the changing landscape in the EU, how can we in the UK keep up with things and really do a bit of nasal gazing. I think after 40 years of using the same methodology in PCM, are we thinking there are other options as well? Behaviour could be one of those options, but also more training, more gathering information is all key. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll sign off now and hope to see you at one of our events very soon. Thank you very much. Take care.